Picture this, June 6, 1944. Thousands of young Americans crammed into flat-bottomed boats heading straight into machine gun fire on the beaches of Normandy. Those boats didn't exist before the war. America had to invent an entirely new way to fight, and fast. We're talking about the landing craft that made D-Day possible, that island hopped across the Pacific, and that turned the tide of World War II. 9 different designs, each one built for a specific job. Let's break them down. The LCVP, or Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, is the boat you've seen in every World War II movie. Troops called it the Higgins boat, named after Andrew Higgins, the guy who designed it. This thing was 36 feet long, could carry 36 troops or a jeep, and had a ramp at the front that dropped down when you hit the beach. The brilliance was in its simplicity. Shallow draft meant it could get right up on the sand. Plywood construction meant you could build thousands of them fast and cheap. The boat could do 12 knots fully loaded, and when that ramp dropped, men had seconds to get out before enemy fire turned the boat into a death trap. Eisenhower later said the Higgins boat won the war for us. Over 23,000 were built. The LCM, Landing Craft Mechanized, was the Higgins boat's bigger brother. It came in different sizes, but the LCM-3 was the most common at 50 feet long. This one could carry a 30-ton Sherman tank or 60 troops. The key difference was the steel hull instead of plywood and a more powerful engine to handle the weight. The ramp worked the same way, dropping down at the bow so vehicles could drive straight off onto the beach. Crews were usually 4 guys, a coxswain and 3 deckhands, all exposed to enemy fire with just some steel plating for protection. The LCM-3 could make 9 knots, which doesn't sound fast until you realize you're pushing 52,000 pounds of steel and cargo through the water with a 225 horsepower diesel engine. The LST, Landing Ship Tank, was a completely different animal. This wasn't a small boat. It was a 328-foot-long ocean-going ship that could cross the Atlantic under its own power. The LST could carry 20 Sherman tanks or 2,100 tons of cargo, and it had a massive bow door that opened up to reveal a ramp. Tanks and trucks could drive right out onto the beach. The ship had a flat bottom so it could beach itself, and ballast tanks that could be flooded or pumped out to adjust how deep it sat in the water. Top speed was just 12 knots, and sailors joked that LST stood for Large Slow Target. Over 1,000 were built, and they became the workhorses of every amphibious operation in both theaters. The LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, was designed to land troops directly onto a beach without needing to transfer them to smaller boats. It was 158 feet long and could carry 200 soldiers. Instead of a bow ramp like the other landing craft, the LCI had ramps on both sides of the bow that swung out like gangplanks. Troops had to run down these ramps while completely exposed to enemy fire, which made the LCI landings brutal. The ship could make 15 knots and had a crew of 24. What made it useful was range. It could cross oceans under its own power like the LST, but was faster and more maneuverable. Nearly 900 LCIs were built, and many were converted into specialized support vessels later in the war. The LCVP and LCM got troops and tanks ashore, but what about firepower? That's where the LCIG, the gunboat variant, came in. Take a standard LCI, strip out the troop capacity, and load it up with weapons. We're talking 3 40mm guns, 2 40mm cannons, 10.5 caliber machine guns, and racks of rockets. The LCIG would sail right up to the beach ahead of the landing craft and hammer enemy positions with everything it had. The crew called it a floating pillbox. It was slow, lightly armored, and a magnet for return fire, but it gave the first wave of troops a fighting chance. The guns were mounted on open decks, so the gunners were completely exposed, making this one of the most dangerous jobs in the Navy. The LCSL, Landing Craft Support Large, took the gunboat concept even further. This was a 158-foot-long craft with a crew of 60, armed to the teeth. One 3-inch gun on the bow, twin 40mm mounts, several 20mm cannons, and multiple rocket launchers that could fire 120 rockets in a single salvo. The LCSL was built specifically to provide close fire support during beach landings. It would anchor just offshore and blast defensive positions while the landing craft made their runs. The rocket salvos were devastating, but wildly inaccurate, so the idea was to saturate an area rather than hit specific targets. About 130 of these were built, and they saw heavy use in the Pacific, especially during the Okinawa campaign, where they formed picket lines against kamikaze attacks. The LCT, landing craft tank, was another workhorse design. It was smaller than an LST at 112 feet long, but still big enough to carry 5 Sherman tanks or 150 tons of cargo. The LCT had a bow ramp like the LCM, but with a much larger capacity. It could cross the English Channel, but wasn't really built for open ocean work. Crews of 12 operated these, and they were slow, doing about 7 knots loaded. Thousands were built in the US and Britain, and they were everywhere on D-Day. The British actually came up with some wild modifications, turning LCTs into floating rocket artillery platforms and flamethrower ships. The basic design was simple and tough, which is why so many survived the war. The DUWK, pronounced duck, was an amphibious truck built on a GMC 2.5-ton truck. It had 6 wheels, a propeller at the back, and a rudder for steering in the water. On land, it drove like a truck. In the water, it could do 6 knots. The DUWK could carry 25 troops or 5,000 pounds of cargo, and the genius was that it didn't need a beach. It could drive right out of the water, up onto the shore, and keep going inland to deliver supplies, where they were needed. Over 21,000 DUWKs were built, and they became essential for logistics in the Pacific, where many islands had no proper beaches or docks. Crews loved them because they were reliable, versatile, and could go almost anywhere. The LVT, Landing Vehicle Tracked, was the Marine Corps' answer to getting troops across reefs and onto beaches. Also called the amtrac, this thing looked like a tank but floated. It had tracks like a tank for moving on land, but could paddle through water at about 7 knots using those same tracks. Early versions had no armor and no ramp, so Marines had to climb over the sides under fire. Later models added armor, a bow ramp, and better engines. The LVT could carry 20 troops or 4,500 pounds of cargo, and it was absolutely critical in the Pacific. Tarawa proved that you couldn't just use regular landing craft on coral reefs. The LVT could crawl right over them. By the end of the war, armored and gunned-up versions were leading assaults, and over 18,000 were built. America didn't start World War II with any of these boats. We had to design them, test them, build them by the thousands, and figure out how to use them in combat. Andrew Higgins built boats in New Orleans. Navy engineers drafted blueprints in Washington. Shipyards from California to Maine turned out landing craft as fast as they could weld steel. And young sailors and Marines took them into combat, learning hard lessons about what worked and what got men killed. Every amphibious landing from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Normandy depended on these boats doing their job. They weren't glamorous. They were loud, uncomfortable, and dangerous, but they got the job done. That's the story of how America won the war, one beach at a time.